Okay, let's begin. Welcome back, everyone in the room, everyone on Zoom. Welcome back to the History of Material Text. I'm one of your hosts, Zach Lesser, professor in the English department, along with John Pollock, curator at Kissock Center, Barry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at Penn Press, and Eileen Malcolm, Bridgeville Schoenberg Fellow, and congratulations to Dr. Eileen Malcolm. Eileen's dissertation defense went great on Friday with her dissertation called Every Living Soul, Literature and Zoology in England, 1100 to 1400. It was a great occasion. We've announced before, but Eileen will be going off to the University of Guelph in the fall, but surely will be back to visit us in the not too distant future, much like our speaker tonight. A couple of other reminders. Next week, Tiffany Stern will be here, a repeat speaker, always great at the seminar. She'll speak on clown images in and beyond the early modern playhouse. And then coming up in a few weeks on April 10th, 11th, and 13th are the Rosenbach lectures and bibliography presented this year by Leah Price on reading from home. And final announcement, the submission period, just to remind you, is open for our annual Stallybrass Prize in the History of Material Text. This is open to Penn undergraduates and graduate students with one prize in each category. You're too late. So if you fall into one of those categories, please submit your work. If you are a Penn professor, please tell your students to do so. And we need the submissions by April 15th. Okay, well, it's a really great pleasure to welcome Dianne Mitchell back here to the seminar. She's obviously a familiar figure to many of us in the room and on the sixth floor in general. Dianne received her PhD from the English department in 2017, and she was a regular member of this workshop, a regular dining companion at Sang-Pi afterwards. Before that, she earned her MA from Oxford and a BA from Smith College. While at Penn, Dianne won multiple teaching awards, including the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching by Graduate Students. And I see online that she continues to get raves from her students at Colorado. If you're Googling for someone's CV, you might accidentally come across Rate Your Professor, which are all rave reviews. One of them says, and I'm quoting, "I've yet to meet one person who doesn't absolutely adore Professor Mitchell." So it's pretty amazing. This is true here at Penn too, obviously. Where Dianne wrote a terrific dissertation called Unfolding Verse, Poetry as Correspondence in Early Modern England. And then she took up a junior research fellowship at Queen's College, Oxford, before becoming assistant professor of English at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dianne, I think, exemplifies the best kind of work in material text, combining a rigorous attention to such apparently mundane things as how you fold a letter, how you mail a letter, where you put it after you read it, combined with careful, close reading of poetry and a theoretical framework for thinking about the intimacies enabled by both poetry and mail, and by poetry in the mail. Dianne has published essays on lyric poetry and material texts in modern philology, English literary renaissance, studies in philology, and her essay on John Donne's Poetics of Mediation in Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies won the Kate Gardner Frost Award for Best Essay by an Early Career Scholar from the John Donne Society. She's also published chapters in the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Early Modern Women's Writing and the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women's Poetry, so it's another field of interest, obviously, and in Shakespeare text, Shakespeare/text, which is edited by another Penn PhD alum, Claire Bourne. Dianne is currently completing her first book, Entangled Things, Lyric Form and Material Culture in Early Modern England, and I think we'll get a taste of that work tonight in her talk on Folding the Lyric.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you for this generous invitation. And I really appreciate those of you who showed up on Zoom. I'm going to make the Zoom people feel bad by waving this handout, which if you just came in, there's still a couple left if you want one. This really isn't from my talk, but the idea is that if you just want to fold this poem, feel free, see what happens. And if, maybe it will spark some conversation after the talk or over dinner. So fold it any way you like, and you know, who knows what will come out of it. John didn't want people to add extra folds to the folded poems that he got out. So I decided to help John out and give you just a printout. So
No paper airplanes, Zach.
that's great. So that's the material
See
text.
all the marks of folding.
That's right. Yeah. John and Lynn found me some great
Didn't fold them ourselves, we promise.
yeah, some great stuff that they claim was already folded when it came into the collection. So I guess we'll trust them. Okay. So as I said, feel free if you have this text to manipulate it with your fingers, and if you want to talk about it afterwards, we can do that. Okay. And the reason I brought this stupid handout was I am interested in practices of like critical making, I think is the kind of fancy term, and certainly my colleague Marissa Nicosia is a great example of this with cooking the archives. These practices that can bring us, I think, closer to both literary texts from the past, but also to ways of engaging with those texts, I think is really important and also fun for us and our students. So that's one of the things that I'm up to at the moment. Okay, so the work that I'm sharing with you today about folding the lyric is a little piece of the intro of my book manuscript, which, as Zach said, is, let's see if I can actually get this slides to work. What am I doing wrong here? Oh, it's probably on. Okay, sorry, everybody. There we go. A little piece of the intro of my book manuscript, Entangled Things, Lyric Form and Material Culture in Early Modern England. And I'll just say that this broader project is really about how Renaissance lyric form accounts for or is inflected by the routine things that just happen to poems, especially as handwritten documents. And so I argue that thinking about form, not just as a set of authorial choices, right, to use a couplet or to use a tercet, that kind of thing, but also as something fundamentally entangled with messy processes of sending or compiling or storing verse, can actually make us better readers of lyric, precisely because this kind of work has the potential to expand the modes of intimate contact that poetry is said to enable. So this talk about folds and 400-year-old poetry is really talk about critical method. And I want to explore with you this afternoon how the practices of close reading that many of us are so expert in might fruitfully incorporate an attentiveness to a feature of poetry that is both hypervisible, but also paradoxically easy to overlook. And I'll model one payoff of this kind of strange attentiveness to the fold by arguing that histories of poetry, folding poetry, overlap in compelling ways with histories of sexuality. And so I want to flag that I'll be talking about some lyrics that really foreclose erotic consent, but I'm going to do so in order to show how embodied traces of paper handling might offer a kind of reparative method, actively opposing an established poetic language of toxic misogyny. So I'm really happy to hear your ideas for how this material might find more life outside my book project. And if you have a particular critical source that you think would help me, please just email me. I've put my email on almost every slide, and I would love to correspond with you digitally about a source that you think would be really great. So please don't hesitate to do that. Okay.
Or we can mail you a letter.
Or you could pull, yes, I didn't want to put that kind of pressure on you, but that would be even better. Okay, so let's talk about folds. The first thing I want to say is that the fold is a contradictory feature, right? It's a place where a flexible substrate creates a division, but it simultaneously brings two sites into contact. And so the fold is not exactly an impression made with pen or type, but it's still an impression that fundamentally alters the page. And scholars of print think about folds all the time, right? Because folding is integral to the production of certain book formats, right? Is it a quarto? Is it a folio? You can tell in part by the folds. But the folds that shaped the many manuscript poems that survive in Renaissance archives remain, I think, a little more elusive in our codicological or our critical vocabulary. Even though nearly all manuscript poems were at one or several points in their life folded, whether as part of being transmitted as mail, during a process of storage among other loose sheets, or as part of a compilation practice that might precede something like transcription into a notebook. So how might we invite this ubiquitous fold into our purview? Do folds matter to Renaissance poetics? Okay, so let's take a step back and just reflect on the problem of how we know that an early modern manuscript poem was even folded in the first place. Sometimes I should say it's really obvious because it's still in the shape that it was folded in centuries earlier. And this example from the National Records of Scotland called A Poem Upon the Amazons is actually still folded into the horizontal quarters that I think it probably was a couple hundred years prior, right? And it came to me in that form. So it's preserving this shape that it's held for a really long time. And you can see it's quite fragile. So that helps explain why it looks the way it does. At the Northamptonshire Record Office, loose poems arrived tied in bundles that preserve much earlier states of paper archiving in especially elite domestic spaces. And handling these objects can be a surprisingly intimate experience. Our hands trace the contours of a narrow paper shape that someone created long ago in the process of securing a poem in a treasured box or other filing system. More often though, a fold's traces are not exactly folds anymore. We know a lyric was folded because what we're actually seeing is a dirt-stained crease. And that's almost every example here that you can look at after the talk, I think witnesses this. So this is a former fold, right? It's a past process that's made legible to us as a dark line or a barely perceptible change of texture in the surface of the page. And so, for instance, what we're looking at now is Christabella Rogers' lyric protesting the powers of Cupid. And it was initially sent, as you can probably see, to her cousin Alice Fennell, where it retains highly visible staining, where the poem was once folded in order to be sent. And you can see a dark horizontal line showing how Rogers turned her sheet into a bifolium, right, a two-leaf document. And then there's further marks showing how Rogers' hands manipulated the poem into a little secure packet ready to be sealed for epistolary transmission to her kinswoman. And then we have, this is quite hard to see on the slide, but there's kind of fainter horizontal creases suggesting further acts of folding for subsequent storage, perhaps by Fennell herself. So there's a lot going on the surface of this page. And I would argue that these are traces no less powerful than Rogers' choice of subject matter, which I would call the rejection of compulsory heterosexuality, or her use of the kind of touching superscription "for my much honored cousin," of the poem's history as a technology of intimacy between two women. So these traces, these folds are part of that history. Where we find evidence of folding, we find a compelling story of creation and reception that I think strains or cuts across more comfortable or more familiar reading methods. In particular, the folds that mark the surfaces of lyrics like Rogers push back, and I'm well aware of the irony of this, on the figurative unfolding that we routinely undertake as critics. And of course, our metaphorical use of this verb unfolding suggests a process of disclosing, likening our intellectual tasks to an act of forcing open a document's inward parts. And I'll come back to this again shortly. But that analogy actively works against the more common trajectory of early modern handwritten poems, which was toward further folding. So instead of seeking a carefully concealed interior, I'm wondering what would happen if we instead try reading the poem as just one part of a longer papery process by which creators and readers left their mark. Hidden, as it were, in plain sight, folds and their traces ask to be taken seriously as sites of meaning making between form and matter, text and handler, past and present. Okay, so let's look at some examples. A loose sheet at the Bodleian Library offers a chance to test, I think, the rewards and risks of an interpretive attention to the fold. I love this example. It's dirt stained, it's fraying. It's only about 6 by 6 inches in size. So it's a really strange kind of size little manuscript. It's visibly crumpled, right? This is not a nice looking poem. Nonetheless, it's celebrated for hosting the sole manuscript transcription with notable variants of Shakespeare's sonnet 128. So there you go. Bruce Smith actually talks about this manuscript, and he notes, though, that there's of course other stuff going on this sheet, other lyrics and lyric extracts about what he calls the pains and pleasures of love. And I want to focus first on actually the verso, right, the back side of this, more famous Shakespeare poem, where we have 2 anonymous poems. Not amazing anonymous poems. I'm not going to pretend that, but anonymous poems that are interesting nonetheless. One begins, "I bend my wits and beat my weary brain." It's actually first published in Francis Davison's print miscellany, A Poetical Rhapsody. Shout out to Megan Heffernan, in 1611. The other I haven't been able to trace. It's an unknown origin, but it begins, "This is love and worth commanding." And while these poems have really not received a lot of attention, I think that being on the back of a Shakespeare poem has not really helped these lyrics, to be honest with you. These verses offer, I think, a strangely compelling synergy between still visible material processes, right, like folding, and what we call form, which is of course what I'm really interested in. Okay, so if you can see my screen and you're looking at these and maybe trying to read them, you might be struck by something strange about these poems. And if this were my class, I would make my students say what it is, but I won't embarrass anyone. I'll just say what probably all of you have noticed, which is that while vertically they share the page pretty evenly between them with this kind of dividing pen stroke, they look more like paragraphs. Right, the transcriber has kind of omitted to have the line break match up with the actual end of the page. So this is a little puzzling, right? And it's puzzling partly because the Shakespeare sonnet on the other side of the sheet, which has the same iambic pentameter as the "I Bend My Wits" poem, hasn't had that treatment. You can actually see that it really looks like a poem here. And so, I think probably the compiler was concerned with running out of space, which is totally justified given the size of this paper. And so form is made to accommodate the limitations of the page here. But I want to suggest that it's not really diminished by these processes. For one thing, the plotting rhythms of both lyrics make it pretty obvious how they're supposed to be read. And I've transcribed a little bit of these for you. And for another, I'm really interested in these kind of collisions. The second poem, "I Bend My Wits," is precisely about the difficulty of manipulating the form of the body such that its outward appearance doesn't betray the true nature of the lover. Right, so he writes, love within small limits bounded can be disguised, but a more thoroughly wounded heart can never feign. And I kind of like how in this textual artifact, the small bounds, right, or limits of the sheet alter this manuscript lyric. But I would argue that there really is no disguising or feigning what this is, right? That this is the form of a love poem. And I mentioned this kind of malleability because I'm interested in this correspondence between a sheet like this and both anonymous poems' thematic interest in bending. So in the lyric, "This is love and worth commanding," the speaker celebrates the possibility of a truly mutual affection. Bliss in one is mirth in either, never breaking, ever bending. In the second poem, of course, the poet bends his wits, a contortion that corresponds precisely with the stain running horizontally across the page, showing where the sheet was folded in half before being folded in half again vertically to create a tiny square packet. And hopefully you can see that on the screen here. So what does it mean that the paper bends, where the poet describes himself bending? What does it mean that true love is said to be so supple that it can bend without breaking? Maybe nothing. Except that when we turn over the sheet to look at the more familiar Shakespearean sonnet, we may suddenly notice how the horizontal line across the page coincides with the words, "thy sweet fingers." This is a reference to the seductive tactility of the beloved's musical performance, we might note, in which the beloved is actually no longer playing the poet's music, as in the 1609 quarto, but rather an unknown piece of music. So I really like this variant from "when thou my music playest" to "how oft when thou dearest music playest." Just kind of a cool change. And so sonnet 128, which you may or may not know, is about the poet's envy of an inanimate object, the keyboard caressed by the beloved's fingers. But the poem's concluding imperative, which maybe you can't see, but I'll read it to you. It says, "Give them your fingers, me your lips to kiss," is compromised by the agency that this paper object grants to other people's fingers and hands as they interact with further inanimate things. So not only is the beloved freed here from the stricture of playing the poet's music, but the poem's crinkled substrate reminds us again and again that a lyric can be bent to suit the limits of a page, and that the bending of paper can operate alongside and sometimes even against a poet's formal choices. And one question that comes up for me is whether the volta or the turn that kind of shapes a sonnet is compromised by more tactile modes of turning. I haven't really decided what I think about that. So we can start to see how book history and the history of lyric form are colliding with histories of sex and intimacy. Reading the folds of early modern lyrics, we're suddenly granted access to a series of textual manipulations that generate friction with an all too familiar poetic language of embodied handling. Especially relevant here is the way that women's bodies are couched as endlessly manipulable by male Renaissance poetic speakers. Right, I'm thinking about that "give me your lips to kiss." And in fact, women often resemble sheets of paper in many so-called love lyrics, not only as part of a racialized and racist identification of ideal femininity with whiteness. And here I want to shout out Brandy Adams' work on fair and foul papers in that Shakespeare / text collection mentioned by Zach earlier that Claire Bourne edited. But because of women's supposed pliability and the way that they're said to literally bend in men's hands. So I want to just think about this a little bit. by looking at a pair of poems inscribed near one another in an elite English and Welsh verse manuscript, Miscellany, Christchurch College, MS 184. These poems use the resolutely material verbs fold and unfold to describe two heterosexual erotic assignations. One lyric boasts how I taught mine arms her neck to fold, while the subsequent poem urges its implicitly male readers to note but her lively parts when you unfold her.
Wow.
And this strategic use of folding and unfolding, indeed, is especially troubling when we consider that the first lyric that I mentioned is about an encounter in which the speaker slips into his beloved's bed, observes her sleeping body, and begins to take possession of it. And so I'm just going to read you a little extract of this poem, since I know it's pretty hard to just read off the page. And then I taught my idle fingers woo each comely part from head unto the heel. Where Cupid holds his camp, I touch it too, and still my mistress felt but would not feel. And so the folding of the speaker's arms around his beloved's neck, right, a gesture of love or violent possession, anticipates the way in which the beloved's body opens up to him in this lyric. Consent is coded as tenuous or absent, with the refrain, still my mistress felt or heard or did or saw, but would not feel or hear or see or do, signaling the relation between the woman's ambiguous response and the speaker's ever greater arousal. Similarly, the beautiful subject of the second lyric, one of a pair of acrostics on the name Blanche Wynne by the Welsh knight Sir John Salisbury, is said to give comfort to the eye. Behold and fold being a perennially popular rhyme pair in the Renaissance, and I think that matters somehow. But of course, she has little say in the unfolding process that would display her body parts as an exemplar of Venus cunning. And I want to note that this is a process that really implicates its you, right? And is that supposed to be us in this act of handling? This kind of feminine reification is uncomfortable to notice and impossible to ignore. And yet I want to suggest that women's historic interactions with texts like these really complicate a narrative in which male poets have agency and women's bodies, real or imagined, do not. When women fold or otherwise mark papery surfaces, they signal a kind of power over the page. And so to look for these marks is to witness a powerfully reparative method, one in which material transactions offer the capacity to overwrite or at least press back on the damaging effects of a particularly forceful form. So this Christchurch manuscript was commissioned by a woman, the Welsh noblewoman Catherine of Boraine, who died around 1591. And so her hands may have come into contact with the undated sheet with the lyric about a sleeping mistress, a leaf whose verso actually bears quite obvious evidence of having been stored in folded quarters before being bound into its present home. For more certain traces of women's material responses, I think we can turn to collections of documents that we know were consistently in possession of early modern women. And one such archive is the archive of Lady Anne Newdigate, who I've had the pleasure of speaking about before at Penn. And in my work on her collection, I got really interested in how Lady Newdigate handled a seemingly endless series of elegant courtship letters from her neighbor, Frances Beaumont, not the playwright, don't get excited, different Frances Beaumont, several of which contain stanzas of poetry by Edmund Spencer and other writers. And by how did she handle this? I mean, literally handled, right? How did she literally handle these documents? Because many of these letters and what I call letter poems witness pretty remarkable processes of reception and use, some of which suggest that Newdigate was a lot more interested in the surfaces of these missives than she was in their content. So let's take a pair of bifolium, again, these two-leaf letters from Beaumont to Newdigate that are stored together in a single file folder now at the Warwickshire Record Office. You can see here, even if you can't read it, that the first opens with a lovelorn poetic quotation in Beaumont's really beautiful hand. It is a comfort in great languishment to be bemoaned with compassion kind and mitigates the anguish of the mind. Feel free to send me a letter that begins with that. And Beaumont, of course, goes on to explain that this extract emblematizes his correspondent, a claim that fits into a larger pattern of representing his would-be partner Anne as desirable, gentle, but an ultimately aloof poetic mistress. She really kept him in the friend zone for quite some time. But his own letter to her bears traces of rough handling, and it's a little hard to see. I'll see if this is working. What we're looking at is just kind of trying to follow the contours of this sheet. And you can see that nearly half of the second leaf has actually been torn away with, with only a stub witnessing the partial amputation of the page that bears the superscription or the address to the deliverer. To the honorable, my best and most worthy lady, my Lady Anne Newdigate, give these at her house at Arbury. And that's upside down to you here. But even this poor ripped leaf looks as though it might have been crumpled. And at the same time, we can see that a vertical line cuts through that address, which would not have been how this was helpfully handed to a messenger. Rather, it suggests that Newdigate, or possibly one of her members of her household, must have folded the remainder of the letter in such a way as to make it fit into a small cabinet or other vessel, along with further loose sheet correspondence and verse. And so here we see loving lines literally bending to suit Newdigate's material constraints. Perhaps more interestingly still, and I've talked about this here before, the second love letter in the file has been marked up with what appears to be a shopping list in Anne Newdigate's spiky hand. So we can see here references to wire whipped with black, such a black purse as my sister's, the it bag of 1600s, 6 pounds of figs, and sugar, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, almonds, along with numerous other items. And of course, this tells us little about Newdigate's feelings toward her suitor. But what it does hint, right, is that the economies of desire, in which Beaumont repeatedly attempted to place his widowed friend, were much less pressing to Anne Newdigate than the more practical economies of caring for the sartorial and culinary needs of herself and her family. Newdigate's responses, and I'm just juxtaposing the shopping list and the ripped leaf here, to her neighbors' poetry and other courtly writing, look little like the learned marginalia that exemplifies what I would call how Gabriel Harvey read his Livy school of reader reception. At the same time, though, I really want to take seriously the fold, or more capaciously, the tear or the non sequitur inscription as possible moments of readerly resistance. Because while tearing and folding and filling blank space are activities routinely witnessed by literary manuscripts, noticing evidence of these habitual actions at women's hands offers a counter narrative to a centuries-old literary tradition that would render women little more than objects. And another great example of this that you might have come across is Carissa Harris's discussion of manuscript readers who literally scraped out with knives some of the obscene language in Chaucer's Reeve's Tale. So reading for resistance is not, of course, the only way to engage the surfaces of manuscripts. Another medievalist, Mark Amsler, has traced across devotional manuscripts, striking material evidence of readers' intensive responses via their hands, lips, eyes, bodies, responses that sometimes register to us as damage, but which he more generously terms affective literacy. And we might think back here to Christabella Rogers' letter poem to her cousin Alice and wonder whether something like love or solidarity can leave its mark in a feature as enigmatic as the fold. Manipulations of the page might speak of intimacies that do not usually speak their names. Expanding the modes of closeness made available by close reading, folds and other surface traces may engender a more intimate and less harmful kind of contact with the literary past than is usually afforded by 400-year-old texts. So folding rather than unfolding verse, I'm proposing, allows us to imagine a different kind of narrative for early modern forms like the love lyric. Ultimately, a commitment to the fold might generate a new sort of literary history, one in which scholars give the same attention to tracking changes in storage practices as they do to tracking innovations in genre, or in which traces of ripping and doodling are key pieces of evidence in histories of textual reception. But I'd like to conclude by asking ourselves whether the kinds of futures that a poem imagines for itself, futures I've been suggesting that we're also asked to participate in, can shift when we read not only for Renaissance poets' desire for posterity or erotic control, but for the ways his or her poem might also be reckoning with its own material life. And so I'd like to look at one more Shakespearean lyric, Sonnet 63, a poem that imagines what it means to endure in verse, even when its speaker is absent and its beloved utterly changed. So I'll just read this sonnet. Against my love shall be as I am now, with time's injurious hand crushed and o'erworn, when hours have drained his blood and filled his brow with lines and wrinkles, when his youthful morn hath traveled on to age's steepy night. And all those beauties whereof now he's king are vanishing or vanished out of sight, stealing away the treasure of his spring. For such a time do I now fortify against confounding age's cruel night, that he shall never cut from memory my sweet love's beauty, though my lover's life. His beauty shall in these black lines be seen, and they shall live, and he in them still breathe. It's easy to read Shakespeare's final couplet as triumphant, time confounding. But when we sit with this lyric as a text designed for folding, the human love object of the poetic speaker begins to overlap in surprising ways with the document that this sonnet envisions. Sonnet 63 seems to set up a potent contrast between the future aging beloved and the poet's own youthful evergreen verse. The materiality of the flimsy sheets we've just been studying, though, contradicts this clear-cut distinction. Most radically, it suggests a surprising similitude between the beloved, who will be as I am now, crushed and or worn, and the papery surface that is said to preserve the beloved's beauty in language. Or worn can mean shabby, worn by excessive use, even hackneyed. But in the context of crushed, it might also signal the repeated acts of wrinkling that nearly all loose sheets experienced, not usually as an injurious act, but through routine practices of handling and storing. In a similar vein, Shakespeare's black lines may mean more here than the impressions made by a quill pen or inked type thrust against linen paper. In Sonnet 19, for instance, the word lines seem related to the marks that time carves in the fair brow of the beloved, suggesting that lines was for Shakespeare a shifting and resonant term. Shakespeare could have written in Sonnet 63, his beauty shall in characters be seen, or his beauty shall in these black words be seen. But this poet, who was keenly attuned to the material processes activated by and around lyric, may have known that the ink with which his lyrics were realized on the page was likely to appear brown to later readers. To read black lines instead as a reference to a fold's futurity, its remainder as a visible stain on the page hundreds of years hence, helps us glimpse in this poetics of anticipation, something that would reconcile the material difference between the long-lived lyric, the poet, and the ephemeral, already fading beloved. Suddenly, Shakespeare's love poem seems less like a brighter substitute for a decayed body than an object that seeks to preserve or emblematize a beauty that is in fact wrinkled and worn. What begins as a prophylactic against the ravages of age becomes a gentler celebration of a form whose meaning resides precisely in not being unlined. The folds that mark the surfaces of early modern lyrics, whether evidence of cherishing or neglect, are never, I've argued, fully vanishing or vanished out of sight. Instead, they can push back on the formal imperatives of a love poem. They can operate alongside a tactile language of endlessly bending bodies and minds, or they can oppose fantasies of human malleability, witnessing instead a set of agencies that we do not always see or want to see in our close reading. Ultimately, folds make it impossible to ignore the hands or even lined faces that belong to the bodies of the past. And so to fold rather than unfold verse is to share in the work of these creating and reading bodies, finding meaning and pleasure and hurt, and yes, even beauty in their black lines. Thank you so much.
Okay, floor is open.
Thanks so much, Diane. That was great. I was just wondering, I mean, there seem to be a lot of different folding techniques that get used over time. And I mean, some of them we saw that you showed, you know, were a longer fold. Can you talk a little bit about what you've encountered in terms of the ways in which some of these letters of poetry and then are folded?
Yeah, and I would also encourage people to look at the lovely examples that you guys pulled too, because I think you can see a little bit of variety. Am I able to pull up my slides again, Zach, or would that, I don't want to mess everything up, but I did put in some like bonus slides in case people were interested. Let me just, sorry, people on Zoom. There we go. So we saw a few different examples, mostly stuff kind of folded in quarters. This is kind of just a really nice visual. This is not a poem, but I have seen poems folded like this, and I'll show you one in a second. Where you can just see really clearly how it's been folded in these kind of really tight folds and then stored in maybe a couple different ways. There's a little endorsement here that says Lady Arabella to my grandmother. And this is Lady Arabella Stewart writing to Anne Newdigate. And so you can see that it was probably folded in those kind of little eighths where the endorsement would be easy to read if you were flipping through and was like, oh, what is this letter about? Who is it to? And I like that, my grandmother, because of course that's only relevant for kind of one generation of readers, and then it's sort of out of date, but it's a lovely trace. And then we have this, I think, later endorsement that suggests that maybe the paper was folded a little differently at that point, maybe in quarters, horizontally. So kind of a cool.
So it was eighths first.
Yeah, I think so. So you're seeing a couple different kind of stages in the history there. We saw, and of course we saw the one. It was the back of that kind of, I think, kind of nasty verse about like getting in bed with your beloved, and it's like not clear whether they're into it or not. And that was clearly folded like this in quarters, and we saw that with the staining on the page. We could see that really easily, but it's like a different kind of shape that maybe reflects a different kind of vessel or filing system. So so you're right. There's only so many ways to fold poetry. I think letters have a lot more variety. I actually found a cool example in one of the books that John set out for me of a letter that was folded, and for security, somebody like ripped the bottom off to make part of the letter into a lock, and it's like the paper becomes its own locking mechanism. So I can show people that later if they're interested. But I haven't found that kind of like really intense like epistolary security as a feature of the poetry that I've been looking at. So in answer to your question, it's kind of less exciting than studying letters in terms of the options available. And I think that probably just reflects some pretty commonplace methods of home storage.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, I see Alicia's hand back there. Yeah, Alicia, do you have a question? That's great. Like this talk, that's fine.
Learn about all the stuff that you thank you so much. And I'm really convinced by this example of Lady Newdigate.
Yeah.
And her
She's the best.
sister talking about that. And I love this idea of like a reparative material, like resistant mode, I guess. And the other thing that's trying about the list is how sort of right? That it's like she has other things to worry about.
Yes.
She has a house to worry about. She can't worry about the construction of somebody else's desire.
Great, absolutely. Love that. Yeah.
The letter aspect is called political.
Yes.
So I was wondering if there's other examples in your research, like
Yeah.
is it always just like a one person to another kind of exchange, or is it one couple to another? Is there activity of people engaging with the letters through, like, I guess, one singular to from?
Yeah, what a good question. Mostly what I've been tracking, and especially with the Newdigate archive, and I'm sorry, Zach, I'm going to ask you to pull up my slides again. Sorry about that. Mostly with the Newdigate archive, because I've been interested in the correspondence that's just coming to her. We actually only have a few letters in her hand in that archive. I've mostly been focusing on examples that really are between one individual and her, and then kind of stay in her household. But I'll show you just a couple of kind of cool things that maybe gesture toward that communal aspect that you're thinking of. Here's her grandson's wife. It looks like her handwriting to me on the back of this letter to her brother. I run my head against a door. 'Tis blind am I now and blind before. So she's writing poetry on the back of this, and then someone below it, I don't know if you can see, has written my mother So there's like another generation kind of commenting on this weird, oh, my mother, classic Mary Daggett. I just love this archive. So what I'm showing you here is, this is another example of Newdigate writing shopping stuff on Beaumont's letters. She actually does this multiple times. And I think that Newdigate has also written these little like decorative flourishes, what I'm calling doodling. I guess it's possible Beaumont did, but it would seem kind of weird to like for the messenger to have to navigate that, but I guess I can't be positive. But there's another letter archive nearby where it looks like a descendant is trying to imitate those little flourishes, and then you see the name Mary, and then this is a different letter, and this is the other side of the letter, and you can see Francis Beaumont's signature here, and then you can see this descendant trying to emulate his really beautiful handwriting. So this might be someone a generation or two removed from Anne, who's literally leafing through these letters and leaving her mark on them. Another Mary, and I've seen Mary practicing her name in other letters in this archive, and you can see they're kind of trying out you're good, right? So I really just love the way that looking at the papers in a family archive like this opens up in inter-household connections, right? Across, the space, sort of time, across time, right? People are not alive anymore, but these letters invite kind of participation in the material surfaces of them in a way that I find very intimate and often quite moving.
Hand up on Zoom.
Yeah.
Ben, was that you?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Can I is that okay? Can you hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you, Ben.
Hi, Diane. Thanks so much for that brilliant talk. That was really great. I enjoyed it such a lot. Thank you. Two quick things. One is you will, of course, I'm sure, know about those gorgeous nothings, that beautiful book, which I've been reminded of throughout this talk, looking at those gorgeous images that you shared. And then the second thing was just to ask you a bit about, I think, sort of power, I think, was one of the things that came through for me in that talk a bit. I suppose the thing that I was thinking about is the way that a substrate sort of gathers and kind of makes available in a singular sense this thing, the poem, the verse. And if part of what these poems are doing, these lyrics, in some of them, in some examples, is this kind of cajoling sort of mode of persuasion about what I want from you, and what, there's a sense in which the verb, the line, the sentence, the syntax, all these things are messy and webby, and they're dangerous in some ways. They're kind of inviting you in. You can get lost in them. They're full of ambivalences and ambiguities and all this sort of stuff. But the sheet of paper, there's something sort of brilliantly manipulable about that. And it just struck me that there's a kind of power there, maybe, which says something like, I can walk away from this. I don't have to, right? I can fold you up, and I don't even need to. And there's something about your attentiveness to those folds that made me realize that a poem is a kind of conversation, actually, and that a conversation is an act of mutual generosity, and we both buy into it. It's a transaction, and the sheet of paper seems in some senses to make available the kind of invisible other side of that conversation, and maybe how it was responded to by virtue of, okay, no, or maybe yes, right? And what I do with it, and whether or not I write a shopping list on the back. Right. So I guess that's a kind of thought. And then I guess the question, I think, is that makes me think a bit about agency, and how do you cope with that? It's a kind of impossible, intractable question, but just thinking about some of these things are folds, but they're also unfolds, and were they folded by the author, or were they unfolded later by who knows? So broadly, agency.
Yeah, that's great, Ben. And thank you for like distilling what I was trying to say, but saying it better than I did. So that's always a really helpful way that I can be in conversation. So thank you. Yes, and first, just to flag, the Gorgeous Nothings, for those who don't know, is Jen Bourbon's edited collection of Emily Dickinson's like fascicle poems is probably what we call those. It's kind of a coffee table book, but it really invites you to look at her poems as like ephemeral material text. And Jen Bervin's really cool because she's a contemporary poet and artist who actually has done a version of I don't know whether version is the right word. She's published something called Nets, where she takes Shakespeare's sonnets and kind of some of the words fall out of them, I guess I would say, and some of them are kind of caught in that net, and they turn into new poems in that practice. So I think that's a really nice example of the kind of engagement that Ben is talking about, right? Where a poem maybe invites you in some way to exercise agency of some kind. I think many of her nets are quite resistant to what some of the sonnets are saying. I find them to be pushing back a lot of the time. But that's a really nice contemporary example of not exactly folding, but like working with the materiality of those poems. I really like this idea of like there's got to be a mutual generosity, right, or something else at work. And you know, whose agency, right, do we care about? Do we care more about how the what the recipient's fingers are doing, or how can we know, or are we interested in what the poet's fingers are doing? I think a nice example of a case that kind of doesn't build that in at all is John Donne, actually. This is his only autograph poem. So it's like the only poem that we have by him in English in his hand. And we want it to be like the Flea or Batter My Heart. And instead what we get is this kind of crappy poem that's like really sycophantic. And it basically says to this noble woman that he barely knew, "You're so great, you're so hot. You know what? You know who else is really hot? Your sister." And I should say all the same stuff to her that I just said to you, but I've run out of room. And we can clearly see that because he picked like this tiny sheet. It's just a single sheet. There's not even an inside that he could have used. And you guys can really see here, I think, how if he doesn't stop right here, his text is going to potentially be visible when he folds it up in like little you know, kind of like eights to be this little narrow packet that is like what it looks like when it would look like when it's folded. So he's really being disingenuous. Like there's no possibility that he could praise the sister because he's chosen this piece of paper that doesn't allow that to happen. And I think, you know, using Ben's kind of language is like a really ungenerous example of that kind of material formal interaction, where it's literally forecloses that possibility of further generosity. And so you know, there's kind of no space for a response in a way. And I just, you know, that's the John Donne poem that we have in his hand. This is what we got. So there you go.
Thanks, Diane. This is wonderful. My question is about the Christchurch College that you were talking about. And I really love what you're doing with looking at the people fold rhymes and how fold and unfold are both doing all sorts of erotic work in here. That imagine the woman has compiled the manuscript and also enact folding and unfolding as a way of responding to the metaphors of folding and unfolding. That's beautiful reading. And I was wondering about it as a kind of loose folio with the manuscript, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that particular loose sheet or about the manuscript overall and kind of what it's doing. I'm really into what you're doing with it so far.
Yeah, let me go back a bunch here so we can just look at it. Yeah, it was probably a little bit misleading. None of those sheets are loose. They've all been bound in, but some of them clearly were. This is gonna be like, yeah, don't look at the screen unless you have a seizure here. Sorry, it's just like too much going on. Okay, so none of these sheets are loose anymore. They've all been bound, and I suspect in some places cut to fit this miscellany. And you know, Christchurch College library just published a issue of their library journal about this manuscript. And I actually have a little piece in it, but it's not about any of this stuff, weirdly enough. And that would probably be the best source to go for more information. This particular group of poets involved in this, there's like a weird connection between the phoenix and the turtle, that like maybe Shakespeare poems. So there's like people have kind of been interested in this weird manuscript for like Shakespeare reasons, right? It's always like the Shakespeare that brings it to people's attention, and then like nobody looks at the other stuff. That isn't quite true in this case, but so I can't really answer your question, Marissa. I mean, I do find it interesting to think about like what were the lives of some of these things before they came to be compiled. Catherine of Bahrain kind of seems to commission this, but her death predates a lot of the content of this. So it's one of those cases that, that Ben was kind of bringing up, where I'm like, I don't want to be like, Catherine touched all of these things, right? Like I can't say that. So I think what we're just, what we can witness, right, is a kind of ephemeral history that precedes something like a book, right? That we have these very visible traces of. We can think about people, using little boxes or cabinets to interact with these poems in ways that maybe actually exceed what you can do with a book. So if anything, maybe it just reminds us that the books where we go to find poetry are just like one tiny life option, right? For something like a poem like this, that maybe was forgotten about, or folded up and not read for a while, or maybe unfolded repeatedly, right? We kind of can't know, but it's nice to have this trace of what it could have been.
Can I, John, you go ahead.
I was just gonna add to that, it's a nice segue. What else can you tell us, if you can, about archiving practice in this way? I just want to, actually, a general thing I could say is that I love this talk. It's awesome, and it's just another, and there's all these interesting case studies. I feel like we're starting to assemble of how aware people are of forms. It's a dumb and obvious thing to say, but people are aware of the form of the book they're buying. They know the difference between quartos and folios. It matters to them.
Yep.
I feel like this is part of early modern practice that is lost at some point,
Drops out.
maybe, or starts to fade away a little bit, culturally speaking. And here you're just giving us another case study of it. So I get the sense of like the tactility of the thing impacting the poem itself. It makes sense to me in the same way you can. The referentiality, it seems like it's shared.
Yeah, no, I really like that there's like a lost kind of I don't know, maybe like a vocabulary or something that we have a really hard time accessing, especially in modern editions. And I really, like, it was in some ways it's kind of stupid to present on this because I really don't consider myself to be an expert on kind of archiving practices, but I have handled a lot of loose sheets, right? And this is just something that I started noticing a lot. And I will say that
when they learn to write.
yeah. I mean, I think Peter would, Peter would say that if he was here, right? He would say like, and you can actually see this in a couple of the examples on the table. Like he would be like, well, remember when someone's writing a poem, the first thing they do is like hold the little margin so that the poem is straight, right? And we kind of miss that, right? We don't even see it. But I think looking at something like this helps me when I'm reading a poem, say a very different and I think much better verse letter by done to someone he actually knows and respects, Lady Maudlin Herbert. He has this kind of fantasy where he's like, my letter is going to end up in your cabinet and it's going to watch you while he uses the word revolve. You're like revolving the letters of the guy that you're going to get married to. And so there's this kind of like erotic espionage happening, but it's like a poem about watching other papers in a cabinet. And I think it kind of invites us to like think about Maudlin Herbert, not just as like an eroticized body or the mother of, people like George Herbert, right? But as someone who has a really nice piece of furniture that she's carefully storing loose sheets in that she can go through at will. And it's easy to kind of read past that if we don't start noticing stuff like this. So I really appreciate what you're saying about
mean,
like
it's certainly-
reactivating a register that was like crucial
At
to
least in a
these
series of
people.
elite
Totally.
intensely paper.
Right, and where we can still
Shakespeare.
access this stuff because there was storage facilities, right, which is of course crucial to the work that I do. So no, I appreciate your question a lot.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Zach.
no, that's okay. Let's go to the chat.
A virtual question.
Okay, well, she's doing the chat. Is it really only a bad thing to put your shopping list on there? Maybe
No.
Want to read that as a I don't care, but it's also I'm keeping you around because I'm using you for something else.
Yeah, I like that. Beaumont is a really useful source of scrap paper. No, I've written about this habit of Nudie Gates, and I like to read those surfaces across to her account books, which we still have, where we see a lot of the same kinds of goods. And I think that really speaks to Alicia's question of like where do we find community in something like this archive? Well, we see it when we look at her accounts, and we see who she's buying this stuff for. Her children, her friends. We see her giving money to poor people. We see her paying her servants, right? So these elite courtship letters have this kind of extended paper life in her household in really cool ways. Yeah, is there a question from the chat? Oh yeah, great.
Oh,
Hi,
wow.
are you ready for me?
We're ready for you.
Yeah.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much, Dianne. This was beautiful. I absolutely loved it. I will say you totally transformed after listening to this gorgeous talk that thought about all the points of contact, papery points of contact and material intersections, right, between poems and pages. You totally transformed the way I was hearing Sonnet 63, where I heard not our presumed projected identity of the poet speaking, right? But I heard the poem speaking in like a completely new way. So I want to thank you for that. And I think my question is coming from there and from your response to, I think it was Marissa, but about poems and books, right? So as somebody myself who spends too much time thinking about poems and books and not enough time thinking about, poems sort of fluttering, flying loose around the world, it was striking that the confluence of agencies that you traced, I loved that term, right? And the sort of embodied poetics of the past were so profoundly one genre, right? And I'm guessing that's just this talk, right? I'm guessing we don't just get love poems flying around. But I'm interested because I'm always thinking about the points of material and formal contact between contiguous poems, right? So I'm interested, and like the Shakespeare example and the Rawlinson manuscript was one instance of this, but I'm interested in like the places, the examples you've seen of like poems touching other poems, or the kind of like, if you have a sense of like, if we want to call this a genre, right, or a field at large, right, like what kind of comes to dominate these kinds of communications, what lyric forms kind of come to dominate these communications, like what happens when you scale up from the individual poem that you've taught me how to read in a different way, right? Do we read all these other poems in different ways too? I think it's some version of my question.
Yeah, there's a couple of really cool things happening there, I think. I'm gonna just flip back to my slides so that you guys don't have to be awkwardly hovering here. Yeah, no, this is like the obvious, like an obvious direction, right, for this work is like, is it scalable, right? And I think, I think there are certainly more poems that we could read, as you say, like Sonnet 63, in really quite new ways. And I have to say that I kind of was surprised when I like came back to this poem. I was like, oh wow. I think there's more examples of this to be done. I wonder whether I'm kind of more interested in scaling something like method rather than scaling the archive so much, Megan. I mean, I've kind of been wondering whether one direction I could take this work is to think about how looking for traces of what we might call women's agency or pleasure, which are like really hard to find, right? In the past, whether that just needs to provoke a kind of really meta-critical reflection on method, and to just expand the kind of tools that we have as readers, to not just say, okay, we can only find women's agency when women are writing back to men, right? Or when women become authors in their own right. Like, these are really powerful things and important things, and things that I continue to write about. But I wonder whether we're missing a whole category of kind of feeling, or, you know, what I've been calling resistance, by kind of sticking to close reading as our chief method. And by our, I mean, like, those of us in the room who are kind of like English majors, right? Which some of us, but not all of us. And so I'm kind of wondering whether where I want to take this maybe has to do with pursuing more methodological imperatives, whether it's something like tracing folds, or looking for other kinds of not necessarily linguistic marks in archives. I think that there's some really cool digital methodologies, right, that are also interested in reading in a different kind of way, that would be really fun to pair with this. So that's kind of one idea. I'll also say that Marissa had to leave, but Marissa Nicosia and I are really interested in working on the places where lyrics and recipes collide. So often lyrics in men's hands and recipes in women's hands, sometimes on a single leaf. So I think that's another direction for the kind of thing you're talking about, Megan, that to like try to make something of that material cohabitation that happens so often, but often gets missed.
I mean, another place that I'm gonna ask my question, but what you said also, in terms of a larger critical methodological focus, it certainly felt like you also have something you want to say to like the surface versus depth reading.
Yep.
I felt that, but it's not formed yet, maybe, but that seems like another area.
That in my essay on the Newdigate papers, which is in that this volume called, I can't remember the name of it, it's like Feminist Formalism, something, that Laura Dodds and Michelle Dowd edited, I think last year. The name of the paper about the Newdigate archive is Surface Desires, and it's about how like women's affective relationships don't leave the same kind of monuments on the landscape of the 17th century, and like literally monuments, right, that men's intensive intimacies do. And so it's kind of about like how we shouldn't be scared of surfaces, because that's where we find all of the emotion and the kind of, it doesn't always look like what we want it to look like, but that's where we find feeling. And women's intimacy is by looking for things like folds and writing shopping lists on letters. And so rather than lamenting this, right, we actually need to be more open to it as a method if we're ever going to give women's relationships the same attention in the literary historical archive that men's friendship, right, and all that contains has received.
So that you're actually getting at what may be your answer to the question I was going to pose.
Okay.
Again, interestingly, which is another area that this makes me think about, kind of a big theoretical area, is in the realm of like editorial theory.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the strands running through your readings of these poems have to do with like what editors would call the difference between substantives and accidentals.
Oh
right?
boy,
Like
yeah.
what counts as part of the poem and what doesn't. And so we see like for the one writer, the thing that almost always counts as part of the poem is line breaks, but for that one writer, it does not, right? And punctuation is usually classed with, accidentals.
Yeah.
And then the question of whether like the material substrate matters at all, the hand, whether that matters, the folds.
Oh God, yeah.
And then, thinking about your rereading of Shakespeare's sonnet, you're doing, I think, a kind of intentionally almost perverse reading.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Perverse, but
Right, because part of the
absolutely.
point of the immortality topos, right, is that it's never really about when he says, so long as this and this gets like, it's not about physical. They all know that the physical book could be destroyed and all,
Yeah.
right? It's the abstracted immaterial lines
Yeah.
that persist.
Mhm,
So there, it's purely the substantive,
mhm.
right, of the verse
Hmm.
that
That's a
is
nice way to
immortal.
phrase
And
it,
that's the
yeah.
paradox of the immortality topos, right? Is like the stone may crumble and the paper may burn, but like the lines will endure. So then, and this is where I think you may be starting to answer my question
Okay.
in an interesting way, which is you seem very much on the side of the accidental
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the material. And it's like the location of resistance
Mhm,
is always on that side.
mhm,
And I was kind of wondering, like,
mhm.
why is that? Is there
Yeah.
something inherent in the material text, the accident that, is where resistance, maybe for those in less power or
Yeah,
just
or
other
pleasure
kinds of
or whatever.
resistance
Yeah.
reading, inheres, and why would that be rather than in the abstract or immaterial, which
Mhm.
I feel like that kind of lines up nicely with the ideologies of this room.
Right, yeah.
But maybe it's a modern,
Agreeing with me.
Right. but
Yeah.
itself is kind of modern, could be our modern view that like
Yeah.
there's something good about the material and something bad about like the
Yeah.
platonic or the ideal. But then when you were talking about, it felt to me like you were perhaps answering it and kind of rooting it historically in the idea of like, well, who has access to the immaterial or the abstract or the ideal in the period and who does not, right?
Yeah.
When you were talking about what monuments people can create. Or, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, and I don't really have a good answer for Zach, but like I do think Shakespeare is interested in the kind of nitty gritty. Like, obviously, he wants lines in like a ideal sense, right? But I don't know. I think he is. I think he is not totally bypassing that kind of stuff that we care about in this room,
Writing
and
about it all the time, for sure.
and I don't think we should bypass it either, right? Even if our instinct is to say, yes, remember my name, fame, I want to live forever. Like that's the goal, right? Like, I don't think we need to participate in the skipping over of like texturally, right? Like what that entails. Because weird stuff happens when we do cool stuff. And I think you're totally right. I think, although I wouldn't have been able to put it this way to myself, like maybe I am interested in that really subjective and often quite hard to parse micro instance of someone touching a thing, right, in a way that we don't always know how to talk about. And I think formulating like a critical vocabulary for saying that's actually where like critical praxis and both then and now is happening is like maybe my job going forward. So I thank you for framing it in that way. Yeah, thanks everyone. Oh, cool.
Great, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, this will go back to folding. As some of you might know, I'm also always doodling as a folder. I'm a origami teacher and so on. And I just wondered if you can tell from the letters that where you've examined the folds, if you can see evidence of enclosures.
Mm-hmm.
Either from the dents or from the size of the fold.
Yes. Sometimes you can suspect that a poem was an enclosure, even if you don't have the letter anymore, if that's probably what you're asking, because it's
Either way, I mean, it's,
no, you can a lot of the time. You can a lot of the time, and that's kind of cool to think about, right? Like we think of poems as these kind of rarefied things that actually as stuff that literally was inside another piece of paper. Yes. I think that's actually kind of like a nice reminder of both the mobility of poetry, but also that it's just another category of enclosures along with stuff like chickens and carrots and
Yes.
and beads and books, right?
Mhm.
Actually, these are the things that get mentioned in letters. Oh, I've enclosed, and they don't really mean enclosed always, right?
Yeah.
I've enclosed a haunch of deer. It's like, well, no, you
Right,
haven't.
right, yes,
Like,
yes.
you're not enclosed a haunch of deer. Like, God help you. Dunn says, like, I've enclosed my heart. It's like, no.
Right.
Right. So I really like
Mhm.
that kind of reminder that another thing that just knowing a little bit about how letters
Mhm.
get folded, right, can
Yes.
help us is to kind of form new categories for something like lyric.
Mhm.
Like, is
Yeah.
it more like Dunn's 1635 poems, or is it more like the gift of a necklace that
Mhm.
Gates' friend sends her daughter, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe there's a benefit to being able to move in that direction as well.
Mhm. And I just also wanted to mention that a couple of weeks ago, I heard a talk by Stefan Hans that was on the German Historical Institute of London's series, where he's been using the pandemic as a chance to analyze things that have touched paper and books in using protein residues rather than DNA residues. And you can't help, I can't help thinking about whether such a thing could be used to actually to count how many hands touch the letter.
That's like a really amazing methodological extension of the kind of work that we do, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't think I'm gonna be one of those people that's like scraping dust particles.
No, I don't think any of us can afford it.
When I said that we participate in the futures of these poems, like we obviously do in this, as you say, in this really literal way, and that like now my genetic material is all over these books that John and Lynn pulled for me, right? So like I am part of their story. Inadvertently, right? And it would be cool to that really opens up, I think, a methodological direction that's like maybe too big for what I'm trying to do, but is so exciting in terms of like, yes, if we're thinking about agency, right? Actually, here's a different kind of way to track that looks nothing like the way I was trained as an English student. So, thank you for that, though. I think it's important.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I think we have kept Dianne long enough and kept our visitors from other time zones long enough. So let's join me in thanking Dianne.